There were no leaks, no whispers online, no last-minute rumors spreading through group chats. SmackDown went live like any other night, loud, polished, predictable. The crowd was warmed up, the cameras were steady, and the rhythm of the show felt familiar. In the center of the ring stood the champion, Alexa, holding the title high with the confidence of someone who believed the division had already been conquered. Her voice carried that practiced arrogance, the tone of a champion who had repeated the same speech many times before. She spoke about dominance, about there being no one left, about how the future belonged to her. The crowd responded on cue. Boos landed where they were expected. Everything felt controlled. Then until it didn't. There was no explosion, no sudden pyro, no dramatic countdown, just a sound. One single, haunting note echoed through the arena, a piece of music that hadn't been heard in years. It wasn't loud, it didn't demand attention, and yet, it cut straight through the noise like a blade. Alexa stopped mid-sentence. The confidence in her posture cracked for just a second. Around her, the crowd's unified reaction dissolved into confusion. 15,000 people turned their heads toward the entrance ramp almost at the same time. The cameras hesitated. Even production seemed unsure of what was happening. This wasn't on the rundown. This wasn't supposed to happen. For a moment, the broadcast tried to stay on the champion, but the energy in the building had already shifted. Something bigger had taken control. The lights dropped. Not completely, just enough. A single white spotlight appeared at the top of the ramp, cutting through the darkness. The arena fell silent. Not the kind of silence caused by boredom, but the heavy, breath-held silence that only comes when people realize they are witnessing something impossible. A silhouette stood in the light. No face, no pose, just a presence. For years, she had been a memory. A what if. A name fans stopped expecting to hear again. But in that moment, memory turned into reality. She didn't rush forward. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who knew the entire building was watching and didn't need to prove anything. The crowd didn't scream. They didn't chant. They froze. Some fans covered their mouths. Others stared, eyes wide, afraid to blink. Phones shook in trembling hands as people tried to capture proof that this was real. In the ring, Alexa's face told the story better than any commentary ever could. The color drained from her expression. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't a return. This was an invasion. And the moment everyone had stopped believing in, had just walked back into WWE. The broadcast cut to black, but the real shock had only just begun. The moment the red on-air light went dark, the controlled chaos of live television vanished. What replaced it was something far rarer in WWE: silence. Gorilla position, usually filled with producers shouting cues and wrestlers pacing for their segments, felt frozen in time. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every headset came off slowly, as if removing it too fast might break the moment that had just happened. This wasn't a surprise just for the fans. This was a secret held so tightly that even the people responsible for running the show had been kept in the dark. Writers stared at each other, scripts hanging uselessly in their hands. Camera operators replayed the moment in their minds, realizing they had captured something that would be replayed for decades. One veteran producer, a man who had seen legends come and go, didn't celebrate. He simply nodded once. He knew history had just been written. She walked through the curtain without acknowledging anyone. No smiles, no hugs, no dramatic pause. Her boots echoed against the concrete floor as the hallway parted in front of her. Wrestlers stepped aside instinctively, like people making room for a force of nature. These were women who had built their careers during her absence. Champions, contenders, rising stars. And yet, in that moment, they felt secondary. She wasn't a coworker anymore. She was an event. The locker room she once called home no longer belonged to her. Her nameplate was gone, replaced with the branding of the reigning champion. The message was cruel but clear. The machine had moved on. Time had buried her without ceremony. She stood there for a moment, hand hovering near the door handle, then let it fall. That room wasn't hers anymore. A nervous production assistant led her to a small, unmarked room at the end of the hall. No decorations, no personalization, just a bench, a mirror, and silence. When she sat down, the adrenaline finally began to fade. The roar of the crowd felt distant now, replaced by the dull ache of reality settling into her bones. Her phone, vibrated. One message from her sister. Are you sure you're okay? She stared at the screen longer than she meant to. It was the first time that night she allowed herself to breathe. She hadn't asked herself that question yet. The return had worked. The shock had landed. But what came next was heavier than any title, any rivalry, any crowd reaction. Outside that small room, the wrestling world was already exploding. Inside it, she sat alone, realizing that coming back was the easy part. Staying would be the fight. By the time the arena lights powered down completely, the outside world had already lost control. This wasn't just a trending moment, it was the only moment. Social media timelines stopped scrolling forward and began looping backward, replaying the same few seconds from different angles, different phones, different reactions. Shaky fan footage spread faster than the official broadcast ever could. You could hear the gasp in every clip, feel the disbelief in every scream that followed. For once, the internet had been beaten. No leaks, no rumors, just pure, unfiltered shock. Wrestling journalists scrambled. Insiders who built careers on knowing what would happen next posted rare admissions of failure. They hadn't seen this coming. They had missed the biggest story in years. Message boards that hadn't been active since her disappearance lit up again as fans logged back into forgotten accounts. People who hadn't watched WWE in half a decade were suddenly back, asking the same question. Is this real? The company itself wasn't ready either. The official social media team, also kept completely in the dark, reacted instinctively. One image, black and white. Her silhouette at the top of the ramp. 2 words, underneath. She's back. Within minutes, every engagement record shattered. Likes, shares, comments, numbers climbed faster than servers could refresh. The return didn't just dominate wrestling news. It pushed everything else aside. Politics, celebrities, breaking headlines, none of it mattered that night. The next morning, an emergency press conference was called. This wasn't the usual room filled with niche bloggers and wrestling podcasters. Mainstream media showed up. Network anchors, sports columnists, lifestyle magazines. They smelled a story bigger than wrestling. A story about resurrection. About time. About someone refusing to stay gone. She sat at the center table, dressed simply, her hair pulled back, her expression calm but exhausted. Beside her sat the champion, Alexa, restless and visibly irritated. The balance of power in the room had already shifted. Questions weren't about matches or championships. They were about silence. About why now, about what it took to disappear completely and then walk back into the spotlight like nothing had changed. Alexa tried to reclaim control, snapping at a question about whether her reign had been overshadowed. She called the return a distraction, a relic from the past. But every camera drifted back to the woman beside her. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She gave them nothing, and somehow, that made her impossible to ignore. Later that day, in an empty arena, hours before the next show, she sat in the stands with one of the few people who truly knew her history. He warned her quietly, this place wasn't the same anymore. It was faster, meaner. The business didn't respect the past. It devoured it. The concern in his voice wasn't about whether she could wrestle. It was about whether she could survive everything that came with it. She listened. Then she answered softly, honestly. She hadn't come back to win a title. She hadn't come back for revenge. She came back because carrying it alone had finally become too heavy. And for the first time since her return, the world realized this story wasn't about WWE at all. It was about her. The meeting took place behind a closed door, far from the noise of the arena and even farther from the fantasy the fans believed they understood. The office was quiet, polished, intimidating in its stillness, the kind of room designed to remind people where real power lived. She had only been here twice before in her life, once to sign her first contract full of promise, and once to be told her career was over. This time felt different. The numbers from the night before were already printed out, slid across the table like weapons. Ratings at a 10-year high. Merchandise sold out in minutes. Global engagement exploding faster than anyone had predicted. The executives smiled the way executives always do when they think they have control again. They talked about legacy, about opportunity, about how this return could be turned into something safe, profitable, manageable, a multi-year deal. A limited schedule, big moments, spaced out carefully so nothing ever felt too real or too risky. They spoke as if they were offering her salvation. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, her hands resting calmly on the table. When the folder finally slid toward her, thick and heavy with promises, she didn't open it. Instead, she gently pushed it back. The room froze. Confusion replaced confidence. She told them quietly that she didn't come back to be preserved or protected, and she didn't come back to be rolled out for nostalgia when business needed a boost. From her own bag, she pulled out a single sheet of paper, plain and unremarkable, and slid it across the polished surface. One match, winner take all, champion versus her. No safety net. If she lost, she would disappear completely. No rematches, no returns, no Legends deal waiting quietly in the future. A lifetime non-compete. One night to finish the story, or she would walk away forever. The executives stared at the paper like it was written in another language. They asked why anyone would risk everything after 5 years of silence, why she would gamble her entire legacy on a single moment. She stood up slowly, finally letting emotion creep into her voice, and told them she wasn't gambling. She was choosing an ending she could live with instead of one that had been forced on her. Outside that room, the world believed they understood the narrative already. Fallen queen versus unstoppable champion, revenge dressed up as redemption. But inside it, the truth was much quieter and far more dangerous. She wasn't fighting for a title, she wasn't fighting for respect. She was fighting for the right to close a chapter on her own terms, no matter the cost. The final truth had nothing to do with the ring, the title, or the company that now promoted her return like a myth come alive. Long after the noise died and the cameras stopped following her, she was alone in a place no fan would ever see, a quiet rehabilitation clinic, empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft echo of her own breathing. The mat beneath her was thin, unforgiving, and familiar in the worst way. Her surgically repaired knee burned as she pushed through another repetition, sweat mixing with tears she refused to wipe away. This was the part of the comeback no one cheered for, the part without music or applause. Every movement reminded her of the night 5 years ago, when everything stopped, when her body betrayed her and the world moved on without waiting. On the bench beside her sat a worn gym bag, and on top of it, a folded piece of paper she had carried with her longer than anyone knew. She unfolded it slowly, as if afraid the words might fade if she looked too hard. The handwriting was uneven, written in crayon, the return address from a children's hospital. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a demand. It was a memory. One simple line telling her that her last match had been the final thing a child watched with their mother before she got sick, and that they wished she had one more. She closed her eyes as the weight of it settled in, heavier than any championship belt ever could be. That was the promise she had been carrying alone. The reason the silence became unbearable, the reason disappearing forever had stopped being an option. She didn't come back to rewrite history or erase what had been taken from her. She came back to answer a question she had never been able to let go of, whether she could still choose her own ending. The world believed her return changed the company, changed the champion, changed the future of the division. But the truth was quieter and far more human. It changed her. In that empty room, pushing through pain with no audience watching, she finally understood that this one match wasn't about winning or losing. It was about keeping a promise to someone who would never know the outcome. About proving to herself that her story didn't end in a hospital bed or a termination meeting. Whatever happened next, whatever the result under the lights, she had already reclaimed something far more important than a title. She had reclaimed ownership of her own story, and that was why she came back.